everyone. This is the first episode of the Freedom of Religion or Belief or FoRB podcast that we are making as a part of Talk About Law and Religion blog. I'm Dmytro Vovk, and my co-host here is Merilin Kiviorg. This podcast is meant to be a platform for the discussion of topical issues related to religious freedom, church-state relations, and religion and politics. Today, our topic is Qur'an-burning cases in Europe, and more broadly, religious and anti-religious expression and the blurring line between harsh but still legitimate speech and spreading or inciting hatred. Our guest today is Ed Brown, who is the Secretary General of Stefanus Alliance International, a faith-based organization promoting religious freedom for all, based in Oslo, Norway. Hi, Ed.
Hi, Dmytro. Hi, Merilin.
So, what we know is that in 2023, there were several instances of burning Quran in Sweden and Denmark. In January 2023, the Danish far-right politician Rasmus Paludan burned a copy of Quran in front of the Turkish embassy. Later that year, Salvan Momika and Salvan Nayem burned the Quran at the central square of Stockholm. These incidents provoked a new wave of debates over religious speech and religious hatred, the scope of protection of freedom of religion or belief, and even the role of religion in geopolitics, as these cases affected the negotiations around Sweden's membership in NATO. Ed, as you're on the ground, can you give us some sense of how Scandinavian states responded to Quran burning and what is all about?
Yeah, so it's often difficult in these sort of situations to understand what is actually happening here. Is this a legitimate critique of a religion? For instance, there have been cases of the Quran being desecrated earlier with, for instance, female women who have converted out of Islam. They come from Iran, for instance, and to desecrate the Quran, they've taken a grater out in public and graded the Quran. But it was more of a political sort of statement saying something against the treatment of women, and it was directed more at the regime in Iran. Whereas some of these others have been more of a direct attack on Islam. And so it's in that context that some have called for a ban on any sort of inappropriate treatment of holy texts. And that's where we've seen this new law coming up in Denmark. But in Sweden, in Denmark, and even in Norway, there have been burnings of Qurans or attempts to burnings of Qurans, and there have been different responses. The Swedes, the Danes allowed it, and it created this uproar. The Norwegians, at first, the police gave permission, and then as they saw where it would be done and how it would be done, pulled back the permission, but used it on the grounds of public safety. And it was a specific incident, but not a general ban on it that we've seen in Denmark.
But doesn't criminal law protection of religious articles or texts constitute, I would say, a form of blasphemy law? Because by implementing this regulation, we actually protect some material subjects related to religion rather than protecting human beings, because we know this cliche that has been reiterated all the time that freedom of religion or belief is not about protection of religion or some subjects related to religion, but about protection of people.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I think the former Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, Heiner Bielefeld, often says that freedom of religion or belief has nothing to do with religion directly. It's only indirectly through the human beings that actually practice those religions, the individuals and the groups. And so this is a de facto blasphemy law, although I would say it's a narrow blasphemy law, not a wide blasphemy law. I've now read through the text and then the fact sheet the Danish government has produced to define what they mean by inappropriate treatment, what they mean by an object, and what they mean by religious community. So it's a very narrow one, but it is definitely what I would call a blasphemy law.
But will it cover all religious texts or some specific religious texts, all religions or some designated religions? How it should work in your view?
Yeah, so again, I can read from what is written in the fact sheet. So they produced a law, and it's a short text talking about the public intended inappropriate treatment of any sort of object of specific and religious importance for a religious community. So specific important significance for the community. And then in the fact sheet, they go on to define what they mean by an object, and they narrow it down to say it primarily has to do with texts, not with images, for instance. Although my question to this would be, who's going to stop some religious community saying, but our image of the Buddha or image of the god Ram or is just as important as the text is in our tradition, and therefore it should also be covered. So that would be the next step that I would see. But at this point, the fact sheet indicates that it should only be a text, and then they give examples, and they give 4 examples: the Bible, the Quran, the Torah, or the Vedas. That's not an exclusive list, but it gives some indication of what it means. And then it does not include clothing specifically, they mention. And then it says that any religious community, and then they specify it doesn't have to be necessarily registered as a specific community. So they try to narrow it, but it's a vague enough definition that I can see groups saying, but our particular way of worshiping is being impinged upon, our understanding of the holy, because it has something to do with the holiness within that, a high degree of holiness, the text says, for that particular religious community. And who defines that? The religious community themselves. And if they say that this is, for me or for us, a particular high level of holiness for us, sacredness for us, then why shouldn't that also be covered? And that would then open up a much wider ban on what can be said and done to any sort of religious objects.
Merilin, does it sound as a blasphemy law for you?
It does, and I have actually a question to add as well. How much there is a debate whether current hate speech laws cover these certain matters? And the other question I have in my mind is that do religious communities themselves support that kind of amendment in the law?
Yeah, okay. Two questions. Let me answer the second one first about religious communities. We've seen a difference between Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Within Denmark and to some extent Sweden, we've seen a much greater reaction from parts of the Islamic community, the Muslim community, and are welcoming this. Of course, we've seen it abroad. Various countries that have a religious majority, Muslim countries, have welcomed this and said this is a correct step in the right direction. But within Denmark and within Sweden, there have been some groups, not all, and I don't know if it's in the majority, but some more outspoken groups have said this is the right way forward. In Norway, they didn't. And I think one of the distinctions is here in Norway, they have what's called in English, the Cooperative Council on Religion and Life Stance Communities that's existed for a number of years that meet together regularly to discuss how to peacefully coexist in a multicultural, multi-religious society. And immediately when the burning started in Sweden and in Denmark, they got together to discuss how will we address this if it comes to Norway. And then when it was proposed to be done in Norway, they met to discuss it, and they came out with common statements on, while this aggrieves us, we think it's morally abhorrent, we don't like it, we don't think that there should be laws banning it. So there's a completely different discussion in Norway than was happening in Denmark and Norway. And I think part of it has to do with this proactive work being done by this cooperative council that has existed for many, many years, where the religious communities can talk together and say, we support you, Muslim community. We are also saddened when this happens. And so they feel like they're not being put under pressure, or they're not in any way being demonized because the other religious communities are surrounding them and helping them. So that's the second question. The first question, whether hate speech laws adequately address this. Now, as you know, hate speech laws vary from country to country, of course. And of course, all of them should be in line with whatever international conventions that the countries have ratified. And if we look at the most important conventions probably around this, we have in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Articles 18, Articles 19, and Articles 20, 18 being on religion or belief, 19 on freedom of expression, and Article 20 on prohibiting hate based on a number of criteria where religion is one of the criteria. And those criteria, then I think are, I don't know if we can say adequate because we're still working with them. But I think there are enough indications that the work that's being done using those articles and the Convention on Anti-Racism, the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, have been used in the Istanbul process to produce the plan of action, the Rabat plan of action. Thank you, the Rabat plan of action. Yeah, which introduces 6 criteria which need to be met. So it's a high threshold for what is hate speech. And in the first, the principle underlying it is that any sort of hate speech has to pass the test of to whom, is it directed to a group or individual, directly to them, or is it directed to another group? If I say to a group something that they don't like to hear, that's not hate speech because it's not inciting, and the incitement part is important. I'm just telling them I don't like them in words that might be, they might be inappropriate, they might be hurtful, but it's not inciting anyone to do. But if I speak to another group, and this is where part of the criteria come in, if I stand in front of a synagogue on a Saturday just before they're to get out with a group of skinheads surrounding me, and I talk about how these horrible Jews should be eradicated from the planet, and they start coming out right then, that's a completely different context than if I say it in you know, sort of my bedroom to a few friends. And so these 6 criteria, which I don't have right in front of me right now, but they have to do with who's sending it, what sort of power do they have, to whom are they sending it, what's the particular context, what is the intent, which is often very, very difficult, and a couple of other criteria. I think those, if they have been used more in hate speech laws, would be very, very useful. And they would set a high threshold, but it would be a threshold that could be used to determine whether something is hate speech.
Let's focus on this. I mean, the problem of being offensive or non-offensive speech, because it, of course, reminds me the Pussy Riot case, right? And I'm asking myself, can this some sort of offensive speech or offensive behavior with religious articles be a form of political speech or a feminist protest? And as I said, Pussy Riot, an obvious example here, you might remember the Russian punk feminist group. They made a performance against Vladimir Putin at the altar of the Cathedral of Christ the Savior. They were singing something like Mother of God, drive Putin away. And while it might have been, probably was offensive for many Christian Orthodox and provocative for them, it was clearly a political protest, which in democratic societies would not have ended up with 2 years in prison, as it did with Pussy Riot girls in Russia. So my question to both of you, can you imagine a situation when Quran burning on some similar acts are proper expression, still offensive but legitimate expression of some sort of political or any other position? Ed, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think we're looking at the complexity of the world here, and it's seldom such that a type of speech is only one type of speech. It can be simultaneously a religious expression and a political expression, or a political expression in a religious context, or a religious expression in a political context. And so they interweave with one another. So I don't know all the details surrounding the Pussy Riot case, and I don't know exactly why they were, what the charges were against them. But I think definitely has a serious political element where the made target had to do with the political system, and they happened to use a religious context in which to do it, which then brings down the wrath of both the political people who are being challenged and then the religious community that's feeling offended.
I think
Merilin.
interesting in that case also was that Russia was insisting, in my view, of the looking at the context in a very narrow way, like where this act was happening, rather than the political and surrounding social context, which also court was bringing up, that was actually set aside and not really looked at. Plus, Russia was insisting that we don't look at the content of the speech. for very obvious reasons, probably very uncomfortable to start to dwell in the domestic courts on the on what exactly the girls were singing about and protesting about. So their focus was definitely there. But recently I came across a very interesting article by a Danish scholar, Niels Wielding, and he was commenting on actually not the Pussy Riot case, but on the imam laws, the 2016 kind of changes or in Danish laws, or attempt to change Danish laws. And he was also saying regarding the context and who is speaking, that if the imam has in his official capacity saying something, but when he steps down from his religious office, changing into T-shirt and says the same thing, which can be also considered as a political statement. So it is a fine line, and I think in the actual world there is no other way than case by case deciding over these things, and lots of multitude of factors influence how courts, for example, will decide over these cases. Even in the Pussy Riot case, the court was saying that there are multitude of factors. No one small factor is influencing the decision of the outcome.
But coming back to Denmark, Ed, in your view, what's the main goal behind the criminalization of Qur'an-burning cases? What is all about? Is it about public order or national security, or what?
Yeah, so what's come out publicly, what the government has used in its arguments, has been the public or even national safety. And I think we have to make a distinction. Article 18 talks about public safety being a legitimate grounds for limiting religious expression or religious practice. Article 19 talks about national security. So if it's a purely religiously related expression, then it's not legitimate to limit it based on national security. But if it has both aspects, you could limit it based on one or the other. And then they've seemed to say that, and part of the argument is that Danes living abroad, embassies are under threat. But interestingly enough, as I was preparing for this, I started reading some articles and looking at talking with friends who live in Denmark, and they said a number of newspapers pointed out that perhaps it's less about national and public security and more about economic security. In other words, businesses seem to be threatened abroad. And that is a much stronger motivation for the government to say, we need to do something about this to better our image for our businesses, our economic interests in other countries. And that's a whole different light, but I don't think that was the one that came out publicly that the government used as part of their discourse. But it seems to be, that might be one of the motivations that's been used here.
So they're just afraid of Danish companies doing business, for example, with Muslim states. They don't want any sort of reaction, and that's why they want to criminalize Qur'an-burning, just not to have problems there, right?
It appears that may be, again, motivation is often multiple. So I'm not saying it wasn't some of the other motivations as well, but it appears as though this might be one of the things that some of the newspapers were writing about as a possible motivation. So exactly that, what you just said.
Because it provides an interesting perspective, a sort of capitalistic motivations as the reason to criminalize Qur'an-burning. That's quite interesting. In your view,
I'm sorry, which in international law is not legitimate. It's not a legitimate grounds at all. So just that needs to be said. So even though it's used and it might be behind it, that is not a legitimate grounds for limiting free speech or freedom of expression of one's religion.
Yeah, I mean, in your view, what should be kind of proper reaction or a proper response to this sort of cases? Because I would say that an American approach would be just ignore them, because once you start, criminalize those cases, you are turning those people into martyrs, you are promoting what they're doing. So if it's not dangerous, yes, just ignore it. What, bearing in mind the Rabat Plan and 6 criteria, what you both think, what is the proper reaction here?
My reaction would be not to add additional criteria, additional provisions, criminalizing additional acts. I think it's a slippery slope, especially, well, whether it was a business concern or a security concern, especially when we talk about security concern, this the use of security argument is a slippery slope, and one way it can help these kind of provisions, but in a larger scale, in a longer perspective, I'm not really entirely sure that that would not be used and abused in different contexts if it's becomes acceptable kind of a practice in Europe or beyond. And one idea I always have in my mind when I'm thinking about these kind of cases is that freedom has a price. Freedom has a price. So we do have to accept that just because there are some threats, that just because there is a possibility of something happening, we cannot start clamping down on freedom of expression, because it also has this chilling effect that soon nobody wants to say anything critical about anything, and you are concerned whether you're going to be criminally convicted or whether you will be causing an action which of course you have to be mindful about these things, but still I think it is a slippery slope to start criminalizing more activities or more objects, which we are sort of going back to the blasphemy laws in a way, in a circle.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think this chilling effect is a very real byproduct of blasphemy laws, and people will censor themselves. And it doesn't lead to good public discourse. They have very strong blasphemy laws. Interestingly enough, those laws go back to the British colonizers, and they have the same blasphemy laws in Greater India, which included India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and in Myanmar. So it's the exact same law in all those countries, 295, which prohibits defamation of any religions, but now in Pakistan it's been narrowed down to be Islam. And we have cases, case upon case of the feuds between co-workers or feuds between neighbors, and someone accuses someone, and that's enough for them to be put in prison. And if they're not put in prison, the mob will come and they will kill them. And we have cases of that. And people will languish in prisons. They'll go to the first court case. The mob will come. They will threaten the judge, the lawyer, and anyone that if they find them not guilty, they will be killed, and they're found guilty. And so they sit in prison for a number of years more, and then it's gone up to a higher level court. And if that's far enough away from the area where they've been accused, then they're found not guilty, but they have to leave the area they live in, and their family is under threat. There have been no cases of any blasphemy accused being found guilty all the way up to the Supreme Court. Everyone has been found not guilty at some stage because the evidence just doesn't exist. But at the same time, lives have been ruined. Hundreds of lives have been ruined because of a blasphemy law. And it has a huge chilling effect, back to what Merilin was talking about. And then, for instance, we see in Thailand, if you go in, you'll see signs in immigration, do not defame the Buddha. And there are cases in Thailand and Myanmar of individuals being accused of this, put into prison. So having a bar in Myanmar called the Buddha Bar was enough to trigger the blasphemy law. The owners were put in prison. Having a depiction of the Buddha that is not considered okay. I can't remember which museum in Paris had a depiction of a Buddha head on the floor in the museum, and an organization called Knowing Buddha complained about this, and the museum authorities said okay, and they put it up on a pedestal. But just imagine if there was a blasphemy law in place in France about this. Who would have been put in prison? Would it have been the whole museum crew? So again, it's very difficult to know what is considered a defamation from one religion to another. Buddhas on skateboards, Buddhas on T-shirts, or other religious figures. anyone could claim that that's a defamation of our religion. And again, the legitimate expression of the Iranian woman who was really protesting the Iranian regime's treatment of women and how it uses the Quran and Islam to push women down would also fall under this category, and she could be put into prison. And she's a completely different state than these men, these few men who are against Islam per se. And that's a totally different thing. And so you end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So I don't think creating laws, general laws, is the way to go. I think the way to go is like what Norway has done. It's not perfect, but establishing and helping to encourage civil society groups to join together, to meet regularly, to discuss, to support one another, to build peaceful relations between religious communities. And here in Norway, one of the largest life stance communities, the Human Ethical Society, so the atheists and agnostics. So they're also included. So you bring all of the society in together to discuss, and they can then help dampen the anger and resentment that rises up, as opposed to not having those fora. Then you just have different groups spreading up, and you don't know, just because one or two small groups speak loudly and create violence, they don't necessarily speak on behalf of everyone. It's just they're the ones that get the media play, and it looks like they speak on behalf of everyone. So I would be a much more proponent of establishing good hate speech laws. We want to have laws that protect people. And the six-fold test, I think, is extremely important from the Rabat Plan of Action. If they could implement that into the hate speech laws, where you, again, I pulled it up here. So who is speaking? What sort of power do they have? And in what context? Are they speaking from a pulpit? Or are they speaking privately? What is the intent? Do they actually intend to sort of incite? What is the content, the form? What is the extent of the speech? Is it, again, just in the room of this young radical group of men? Or is it reach out to a broader public? What is the likelihood that there will be harm? And then sixthly, what is the imminence? It will actually happen right after the speech has been made. So I think the way to go is to do a case by case, as was stated earlier. We don't need to have a blanket law. We need to address issues as they arise, and then use the criteria for hate speech to determine whether or not it is harmful to a person or a group of persons.
And this is all for today. We are very grateful to Ed Brown for joining us and sharing his insights. This is Dmytro, Vovk, and Merilin Kiviorg for the Freedom of Religion or Belief of FoRB Podcast, part of the Talk About Law and Religion blog of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. The opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily represent the opinions of the faculty or staff of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies or the J. Reuben Clark Law School, nor do they necessarily reflect the views of Brigham Young University or its sponsoring church. Written transcripts of these and other episodes are available at Talk About blog website. Tune into additional episodes at our website and YouTube.